When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the G8 became the G7. Moscow was expelled from the group of the world's biggest economies. So the question that arises is, will the G20 soon become the G19? Poland has already floated this proposal. It is asking the American officials to exclude Russia from the G20 group of major economies as a punishment for its invasion of Ukraine. Officials suggesting that this proposal was even met with a positive response. The name G20 stands for the Group of 20. It refers to the 20 countries that are part of this grouping, including some of the world's richest countries, like the US, the UK, France, China, Russia, India, and others. Combined together, the group are being the heavy hitters when it comes to the international stage. G20 was formed during the 2008 global economic crisis, with the first summit taking place in November 2008. 60% of the world's population living in these countries. They control more than 80% of the world's economic output. While it is a less exclusive group as compared to the G7, the G20 countries have very little in common. They are characterized by diverse political systems and leaders who seldom agree on most issues. This broader grouping makes it difficult to suspend Russia. Any move to exclude Moscow could struggle to find unanimity. In fact, Indonesia, which holds the G20 presidency this year, called the invasion unacceptable but has not moved to impose any sanctions on Russia. In the latest, Poland has floated a proposal asking the US officials to exclude Russia from the G20 group of major economies. This is after Russia invaded Ukraine, and the move by Poland calling for punishment for Moscow for its attacks on Ukraine, which continue since the 24th of February. Officials suggesting that this proposal by Poland was even met with a positive response. But to what extent will this positive response actually translate into Russia being excluded from that grouping? Let's go across now to our correspondent, Susan Tehrani, who's with us from New York. Susan, any reaction at this point from the American administration on this proposal that's been floated by Poland? And what exactly is this positive response that we're talking about?
So as you mentioned, this was something that was floated around during a discussion between the Polish Economic Development and Technology Minister when they had a meeting with the U.S. Commerce Secretary. And the Commerce Secretary said that she would relay that message to U.S. President Biden. And now there is word that the United States is on board. We haven't heard an official statement on the part of the United States, but this is not initial Polish proposal. When the G7 met about a month ago, the Germans also floated this idea to have Russia kicked out of G20 as well. They said that it's very clear that we can't go about business as usual. A month ago was a time when so many hard-hitting sanctions weren't imposed against Russia, but we were somewhat getting there. And then during the annexation of Crimea, as you mentioned, while Russia was kicked out of now G7, it used to be G8, again, there were talks that were floating around about Russia getting kicked out of the G20 as well. That didn't happen, and many believe that, G7 is a smaller group. When you talk about G20, then you have world leaders from 20 countries having to come together to get rid of a single country. So, and then ultimately, when you talk about this positive response, many believe that one of the problems that the West has is they think that everyone thinks like them. At this point, it's very hard to imagine that even in a scenario, hypothetically, that this happens, it's hard to imagine that it would really be significant or important for the Russians to get sidelined or kicked out of G20. But then again, it's also difficult to see whether or not 20 countries can really agree on something like this. When it was G8, that was 8 countries.
Right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Susan, thanks very much for joining us with those inputs and details. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.